Andréa is now. All right, now all the panelists are here too. So we're gonna go ahead and get started then to make sure we can use the most of the 45 minutes. And so I'm just going to start with a couple of bios and do all three of the bios first, and then that way we have more time just to transition between our speakers, who are going to discuss three very exciting books, one of which is already out, and then two which are coming out this summer. So we're very excited to have this group to come and talk to us today about the global Imperial. So if people could stay muted unless you are a speaker, in which case please unmute yourself. And then also, if you have any questions for our speakers, please send it to me as a private chat. It's my name has been changed to Moderator Katie Parker, so you'll be able to see it more easily. So please send any questions, and we'll pose those questions after our speakers have had about 7 to 10 minutes to present their book, because we do have until 45 after to do this one. So I'd like to start with Andréa Doré, who is professor at the Federal University of Paraná. She's researched in archives around the world and is interested in the construction of geographical knowledge about America, as well as in relations between Brazil and the Indian Ocean during the Iberian Union. So very global work. Our second speaker will be Ricardo Padrón, who's associate professor of Spanish at the University of Virginia, focused mainly on the Spanish global imaginary in the long 16th century. Accompanying his latest monograph, which he's going to discuss with us today, he has recently published a co-edited volume with Christina Lee called The Spanish Pacific, a reader of primary sources in English translation. And that's going to be very useful for a lot of teachers, I'm sure. And then third, we have Katharina Piechocki, who's an assistant professor at Harvard in the Comparative Literature Department. In addition to early modern Europe and the history of cartography, she also specializes in gender studies, opera, theater, and theories of world cinema. So I think we could ask her just about anything, really. And she would be able to tell us something very interesting. So we're going to start with Andréa Doré, and then we'll go to Ricardo, and then to Katharina. So Andréa, if you wanted to share your screen with us.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. We had tried to do this before and it worked very well, but now there is, okay. Yes. Okay. Thanks very much, Katherine, for introducing me and for organizing this book session. I'm very glad for sharing this session with Ricardo and Katharina. I think that our books have many aspects in common, and it is also an opportunity to discuss how our present dialogues with the past. Well, this book, Cartografia da Promessa, in English, I think it could be Cartography of Promise or Mapping Hopes, has its origin in a map. In 1612, the Portuguese cartographer João Teixeira Albernaz made a map of South America, this map that I'm showing. Close to its center, he figured the mountain of Potosí and designed an imaginary channel of mountains crossing Brazil until his northeast coast. This starting point moved me to investigate the role played by the Peruvian wealth in the construction of geographical knowledge of South America. The history of name of America is well known. Is well known, but we find in maps and texts, travel accounts and cosmographies, other options like Peruana, Peru, Peruviana, or America Peruviana, Peruvian America. What were these choices based on? Who suggested them? Why didn't these names persist? What is the role of the Potosí mountain in the history of these nominations? I was concerned with these questions, with extrapolating the circuit of canonical texts and reading lesser known authors, along with works like Sebastian Münster, Pierre Appian, Abraham Ortelius, or Petrus Plancius. there is a large number of texts that interested me particularly for their role as reproducers of knowledge about a region that their authors did not know, but that the authority of the well-established texts allowed them to endorse and spread. Many of them remained manuscripts and are not very original and act in the reproduction of received ideas. But there are surprises, alternatives that have not been successful and that undo the monolithic perception history likes to preserve. In all these sources, I tried to recover the paths that led to building a cartographic image and nomination of the continent that synthesized the characteristics perceived since the first literary descriptions and maps, the emphasis on mineral exploration, the role of the continent as a raw material producer. These paths have been erased over time, but an image remains. Until the 18th century, Potosi remained as the main reference, which concentrated on it the most important European expectation concerning the continent. In the information originated in Iberian, if the information originated in the Iberian exploration, the work of encrypting and disseminating it was largely due to Dutch cartography. The promise of richness has profound consequences to the exploration of Portuguese lands in South America. In the second part of the book, I explore how Portuguese monarchs and settlers were moved by an optimistic proximity to Peru. The manuscript maps, most of Portuguese cartography remain manuscript. The manuscript Portuguese maps are, in this sense, a speculative cartography, which expresses beliefs, hopes, and classical knowledge projections on an unknown world, as the 1612 map shows. Important deposits of precious metals were only found in Brazil at the end of the 17th century. Before that, Portuguese subjects found other geopolitical functions for Brazilian lands, especially during the period of Iberian Union, 1508-1640. They were based on the realization that the lands of Brazil were the continuity of the lands of Peru. Brazil could be useful to the crown because it could protect, with its coasts, the access to mines. The silver could be transported by the Amazon basin or by the River Plate. The Pacific was not a safe place for the transportation of silver. And finally, many Portuguese did go to Peru and Potosi, the Peruleiros, to enrich themselves with the silver that Brazil did not offer yet, yes? Certainly, methodological issues were involved in the research, and I made my own choices. I mentioned just two which were fundamental. Overcoming the national scale. Portugal, in relation to its American possessions, was one of them. How did the expectations Portugal had regarding the lands of Brazil fit into Europe's more general projects to the New World? I have worked with different scales in another context. In terms of the construction of knowledge about South America, there are differences in the knowledge produced by the Iberians and what is disseminated throughout Europe. It was important then to recognize these differences, but to refuse an initial hierarchy of their contents was essential to make the author's motivations visible in the documentation. This, as well as the emphasis adopted throughout the course of knowledge and description, are lost when the hegemonic explanation is established. In other words, I understand that it would not be appropriate to rank and classify the ways of describing South America carried out by the Portuguese and by other Europeans, keeping in mind what these forms have become. Well, very shortly, very briefly, this is what I try to explore in my book. I hope it will be published by September. It depends on the situation of this pandemic in Brazil, but I surely will let you know about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you. All right, if you could stop sharing your screen, perfect. And then Ricardo, if you wanted to share your screen, we can switch on and we will compile the questions and have a general discussion at the end.
Well, first, thank you to everyone, to the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's such a delight to be here with Andréa and Katharina about their very exciting books. And my book, The Indies of the Setting Sun, was supposed to have been published in April, but production has been held up by the pandemic. So maybe July, maybe August, maybe the ebook edition earlier. Hopefully it'll be coming out soon. The book was born in a visit to the Biblioteca Nacional in Spain, where I was working on my first book, and I was trying to read everything that I could that had a name like Descripción de las Indias, Descripción de América, and I was handed this book, The History of the Great and Mighty Kingdom of China by Juan González de Mendoza, because in its definitive edition in Madrid, it includes a description of New Mexico, which appeared in print for the first time in this book. And I was stunned by this, because at the time I was really thinking about Atlantic spaces and the imagining of the new world within an Atlantic context. And this book challenged me to think about the Spanish Indies as a trans-Pacific geography. Its author was an Augustinian friar who was Spain's first ambassador to China. He crossed the Atlantic to Mexico, where he was supposed to have picked up the Manila galleon to get to the Philippines and then onwards to China. For reasons that are not entirely clear, he never finished the trip. He only got as far as Mexico. And then he found himself back in Rome, and he writes this book about China at the bequest of Gregory XIII, Pope Gregory XIII. The astonishing thing is that it's one of the most popular Spanish books on a secular topic from the 16th century. 42 editions in about 15 years and translations into all the major languages. And yet I realized that no one in my field was talking about it. My field, I hail from a Spanish department in the United States, where scholarship is very much divided between people who study peninsular Spain and people who study Latin America. And so Spanish writing about parts of the world, early modern Spanish writing, about parts of the world that did not in the long run produce a Spanish-speaking nation state, sort of tends to fall between the cracks of that division. So I decided to write a book about this, trying to figure out the geographical imagination that made this book possible, and that also challenged the sort of the geography of my own field. As I worked on it, the book became a challenge to Edmundo Gorman's very famous The Invention of America, which talks about how the New World came to be conceived as America, the fourth part of the world, a fourth part of the world separate from Asia for the first time. I'm going to go briefly. In The Invention of America, there is a footnote where O'Gorman acknowledges the existence of a vast collection of maps that do precisely the opposite, that insist that America is actually an extension of Asia, and that usually imagine Mexico as sort of the hinterland of China. And I realized that there's actually a whole cartographic tradition that thinks not in terms of separation between America and Asia, but in terms of connection, continuity, or geographies that allow one to imagine continuity to be created. And so one of the things that I'm doing in the books, I'm kind of looking at this cartographic tradition, rethinking maps like this one that are often thought of as part of the invention of America, and looking at the ways in which they actually allow a reader to think about Amerasian continuity, like the one that we saw in the previous map, as well as official cartographies coming out of the Spanish context itself, where the separation of the Indies, officially by the Spanish crown as of about 1580 or so, is between the Indies of the South, the Indies of the North, and the Indies of the West, the Indies of the setting sun. In other words, that part of Asia that, according to Spain, fell within the Tordesillas lines and therefore by right belonged to Spain or not to Portugal. And so this is kind of the geographical imaginary I'm trying to capture, one that even as it separates America from Asia, looks for ways to imagine connectivity and connectedness, and to imagine the far east, what we call the far east, as a far west, a Spanish far west. I have a little outline of a series of chapters to give you an idea about what the book is about. It covers some basic moments. It begins with Balboa and moves on to the challenges presented by changing geographical knowledge because of the Magellan expedition, because of the conquest of the Philippines by Miguel de Legazpi, and then various aspirations to conquer China, to convert Japan, and finally to imagine the entire Pacific as a Spanish lake. And I look at cartography, I look at travel narrative, and I look at official historiography, trying to get at a geographical imaginary that did not become hegemonic, but that teaches us something about the continued plasticity of the world during the early modern period. So I think I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm just smiling like an idiot because I'm a Pacific specialist and I cannot wait for this book to come out. All right, can we go on then to our third speaker? Thank you so much, and now we'll hear from Katharina.
Thank you. For some reason, I'm having trouble sharing my screen.
What's it telling you?
It only shows white iPhone squares.
Oh, that's new.
And at Adobe, let's try that one. It would be really silly not to show you the slides, but let's see.
We can also just put up the title of, or the slide we had if all goes wrong. It's okay.
Can I send you perhaps the
Of course you can.
PowerPoint? Okay. Let's do that. I'm gonna very quickly send you the PowerPoint. My apologies for that.
It's fine.
Okay. I've never had that happen before. That's very bizarre.
No, that's fine. We've been collecting what happens when different people share their screens. So you've added to our collective understanding of what happens here.
Okay, let's see. And it doesn't appear here. Okay, here we go. Okay. So while we're waiting for the file to load, let me thank you, Katie, and the conference organizers for the generous invitation to join the Global Imperial Book Chat. It's an enormous pleasure to be here with you today and to briefly introduce you to my book, Cartographic Humanism, which I just sent, Katie, to you via PDF. So given the short time frame, let me dive in medias res and tell you about the main ideas. As an early modernist, I have always been struck by the fact that scholars of the Renaissance tend to entertain a relatively narrow understanding of Renaissance Europe, often reducing it to a few Western European countries. I myself am Central and Eastern European, and I was born in Poland and I grew up in Austria, and I have studied Romance languages, Italian, French, and Portuguese, so that Europe has always meant more to me than a few Western European countries. I do believe that when we say Europe, we often have an idea about the continent that tends to smooth out the wrinkles of history, as it were. We should, I think, incorporate, however, the wrinkles into our studies of Europe and see them as an opportunity to offer a more complex and nuanced understanding of what Europe is. Provincializing Europe, as Deepesh Chakrabarty has long called for, demands, I believe, a return to the question of what Europe actually means and meant in the past. Thank you. And if you could go to, I think I can't move the slide, so I have to ask
Yeah,
you
you
to
just
move
tell
it.
me.
Okay, thank you. This is perfect. I believe a return to the question of what early modern Europe actually means and meant in the past. What do we mean actually when we say the word Europe? Thinking about Europe requires a critical intervention in the manifold processes which propelled Europe's rise as a continent and an idea. And I argue in my book that these processes started in the course of the 15th and 16th centuries. And this leads me to the second driving idea, and that's the next slide, that prompted me to write Cartographic Humanism. The hypothesis underlying my book, and hence the title, is that the new imagining of Europe as an increasingly hegemonic and sovereign continent was driven by the rise of cartography as a novel humanistic discipline. Renaissance humanism is commonly thought of as a revival of ancient languages and a renewed interest in disciplines such as philology and the theory and practice of translation. And relatively little attention within the study of humanism is commonly given to questions pertaining to space. One tends to forget, for instance, that humanists were spatial thinkers. Petrarch's first philological endeavors were annotations to Pomponius Mela's geographic work, for instance. So cartographic humanism adopts a broad comparative lens, and that's the next slide, that brings together literature, cartography, and spatial thinking from Europe's East and West. As you can see from my table of content, so, yeah, thank you.
All right.
With Germany, Poland, France, and Italy and Portugal, and the choice of these particular countries might seem arbitrary, and of course it is, but there is also historical and geographic rationale for my particular choice. In fact, since antiquity, Europe was conceived in symmetrical terms, whereby the West and the East were specular. They were mirror images, and that's the next slide. Some medieval Islamic mapmakers also imagined, as the anonymous author of the 11th century Egyptian Book of Curiosities, the enclosed Mediterranean Sea symmetrically, as an ellipse in which not only Europe and Africa, but also Europe's East and West mirror one another. The ancient geographers' frequent use of identical toponyms for Europe's western and eastern border regions and cities further enhances the continent's imagined symmetry. In the work of Strabo, Ptolemy, Plutarch, and Pliny the Elder, the toponym Iberia or Hiberia, and that's the next slide, for instance, referred at once to the Iberian Peninsula, as well as to the region in the Caucasus we now know as Georgia. We can see here, that's the next slide, on Sebastian Münster's map of the Caucasus, the reference to Iberiae Pars of east of Colchis. We also see here, north of Iberia or Georgia, Alexander's columns, yet another attempt by ancient geographers and early modern cartographers to delineate Europe's eastern boundaries in symmetry to the Pillars of Hercules in Europe's west. In fact, early modern cartographers saw in both the historical Alexander the Great and the mythological figure of Hercules surveyors of liminal territories staking out continental boundaries in the east and in the west, respectively. In times of territorial expansion and colonization, the symmetry between Europe's east and west was often, of course, politically motivated. The Polish humanist and geographer Maciej Miechowita established an explicit analogy between the Polish king Sigismund I and the king of Portugal, Manuel I. Miechowita thus writes in his treatise, that's the next slide, on Europe's eastern boundaries, titled Tractatus de Duabus Sarmatis. I quote, just as the,
Sorry, it seems to be stuck. Keep going.
Okay, just as the southern hemisphere with peoples adjacent to the ocean as far as India was discovered by the Portuguese king, so the northern hemisphere with its peoples living closely to the northern ocean and oriented toward the east, discovered through the army and warfare of the Polish king, should be opened up and become known to the world. Portugal and Poland stand here in a specular relationship, although Michowita does not divide the hemispheres into East and West, a division only slowly on the rise at the beginning of the 16th century, but what rather adopts a North-South hemispheric division, please, the next slide, in the medieval tradition of the zonal or Macrobian map, according to which the world is divided into 5 climatic zones. We see here an addition of Macrobius with the oikumene squeezed into the northern hemisphere, and the oikumene is, as we see, also inverted by mistake. India is where one would expect the Iberian Peninsula, and Europe is in the Far East. Ample space is left in the southern hemisphere to imagine the potential existence of the antipodes, or around 1500, the inhabitants of the New World. And by the way, when we now speak of the global south, we actually take up the Macrobian zonal map model, which functions as an alternative to continental thinking, as it brings together locales comparable by climes. Let me offer a few concluding words. My book engages with the question, what is Europe? Where are Europe's borders? And what gives Europe a special status? These questions may seem drawn from today's headlines, but they were essential for the Renaissance humanists who formed the subject of my book. The question about Europe's borders is as urgent now as it was in the early modern period, when the idea of Europe as a continent was first emerging. Europe's rise to an ideologically charged metaphor, an idea that came to stand for a universal and secular vision of the human and for a modern world system, has had both extraordinary and devastating consequences on a global scale. During the early modern period, far from consolidated, the blurred, messy, and confusing contours of Europe were being only negotiated. They demand to be disentangled, in particular given our insufficient and often misleading use of the term Renaissance Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. I will stop sharing there. All right, thank you so much. When I was doing comprehensive exams in European history, I know your book, had it been out, would have been on the list for sure, because what is Europe was the thing we were talked about the most. All right, we're going to move into the Q&A portion. We actually have a good amount of time, so thank you very much to the speakers for keeping to time so we can have a broader discussion, especially since all 3 of your projects really do overlap quite well with talking about global imaginaries and cartographic practices. So first, I would like to pose a question to Andrea, but I think actually Katharina and Ricardo probably have responses as well from their own research. But Carla Loa, I'm killing it today. Carla Loa has asked that after the map you showed, Andrea, that was oriented horizontally with west at the top, it was a whole map of South America, and she wondered if there's an explicit explanation for that map being west oriented, and in general, have you found other similar cases? And I'd like to broaden that for Ricardo and Andrea, or sorry, Ricardo and Katharina, especially Ricardo with your larger thesis about kind of looking westward and including the Pacific in ideas of the Americas. So I'll pass it over to Andrea and all 3 of you.
Oh, thank you, Carla, for your question. But I don't have a very satisfying answer because, in fact, this is the only Portuguese map that I found more detailed with this direction. Usually, the Portuguese maps are in the north at the top of the map, and this is an atlas, and I put here just because he's different, but it's not a good example of what I'm trying to prove, that the Potosi usually has a central place on this Portuguese maps, because we found in this precise map many other towns, and usually you have only Potosi. And I show that, and I know that made me a problem, but really, this is the only map that we have this direction, and I don't have a good answer. I don't know how he put in this way. Is João Teixeira Albernaz, and usually he doesn't use this kind of direction.
I'll chime in here. I think westward orientation is actually very important in the work I'm doing. The map that comes to mind is actually Ortelius's map of China, or rather the map of China that appeared in the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, I think that as of the late 1580s, if I'm getting the date correct. And I'll just share an image that I have right now found on the internet because I couldn't find my own copy of the map. So this map is oriented towards the west. And one of the points I make in my book, I'm talking about this one here, is that this is actually significant because on the reverse of the map, the description of China is drawn from the first Spanish book about China, a book by a man named Bernardino de Escalante. And the whole purpose of that book is to convince the reader that China is so far to the east that it is better thought of as lying to the west. That the Portuguese route to China is long and complicated, whereas the Spanish Trans-Pacific route is quick and easy. And of course, the line of demarcation also puts China in the Spanish West. So this is one of the things I'm trying to recover in my book, because I talked about maps and about continents, but like Katharina, she mentioned talking about different geographical epistemologies, of which the continents are only one. One of the points of my book is that if we understand early modern mapping of the world, we have to think about the diversity of geographical epistemologies, including not just the system of continents, but the system of climates, and also this emerging sense of the world as a network of maritime routes. And that's the point being made by this book, which I think then gets picked up on in the design of the map, that when you think of China as a location on a maritime route that leaves from Europe, the better route is the Spanish one and the Portuguese one, the westward route.
May I just add that what comes to mind is the Juan de la Cosa map of 1500, which is also a west-oriented.
Right.
And I don't know whether I should try. So for some reason, there's a problem with my screen sharing. I can't show it, but you can Google it. 1500 Juan de la Cosa, which shows the New World as a stretch, as a very large stretch on top of the map. So very early on in the context, precise as Ricardo was also saying, of the discoveries of the New World, and further, there is a tendency to, oh, thank you,
yeah,
to orient the map to the
right.
west.
And if we look at the writing here and a lot of the other writing on the map, it's clear that it's westward oriented. The image here is of the Nativity. It's a Virgin and Child, and here it's of Saint Christopher. So if we think about, the sort of the narrative movement suggested by these two episodes in the story of the life of Jesus Christ, then not only is the map oriented towards the West, but it's actually imbued with a sense of narrative movement towards the West.
Excellent. And Carla Lois wanted to add in there that it's also a common orientation for, she says, maps of Chile in the 16th century, although I think those would be east oriented, but corresponding to the view from ships. So you also get that part of it. I would like to ask a question for Katharina about, I was really interested in what you were saying about the Renaissance as kind of a historiographical or a literature problem. And I was wondering how you also are dealing with chronological, more larger issues in terms of a lot of historians of cartography focus on the early modern period and forward up to the 20th century, 21st century. But with your work, I wonder how much you were butting up against the medieval, and if you saw continuity there, or you saw kind of a lot of discontinuity, because that's something that gets talked about a lot in the literature, but you seem like someone who's kind of caught between these chronological limits that scholars tend to put ourselves in.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. I'm caught between different places and between chronologies. And I do think that your question is absolutely spot on. I think that a lot what I'm doing in my book is to revise precisely not only the origin of Renaissance humanism in terms of the topics that were taken up by so-called Renaissance humanists, Petrarch, but I show that space is again very important and really a driving force of humanism. But it begs the question, okay, what happened before, and how do we set ourselves apart from previous centuries? So there is not one clear response, because of course cartographic frameworks are epistemological frameworks, and it's not that from one day to the next there is a discovery of Ptolemy and everything changes. Of course, I do believe that Ptolemy's discovery and his increased use from the early 15th century as a major framework also, I argue, to conceive of artificial boundaries and to move away from natural boundaries is a very important factor. But there is a continuity, and I was able to show it very briefly with zonal maps, for instance, of previous models. There is a continuity of the TO map. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting that it was the TO map, a medieval model, that was really the first map to be printed in 1472 in Augsburg. So there is a very important also continuity of different epistemological models, cartographic models and spatial models. And what I find so incredibly interesting and enriching about the Renaissance period is that those models coexist. And what happens once they coexist, and what dynamics, what new dynamics takes off around 1400. And so I move my interest back to the 15th century also. So it's not, I don't start with 1492 and the discovery of America, but I move really to the beginning also of the 15th century and to other countries, Germany, for instance.
Great. We have a bunch of other questions. I'm going to prioritize one more because I want us all to get to the closing remarks on time, as they are important too. So for Andrea and Ricardo, how does the silver trade from Potosi, and in general, I would add the silver trade over the Pacific with the galleon trade after 1562, how does that inform this trans-Pacific connection you're talking about?
I'll let Andrea start.
Well, I was looking not, in fact, to the Pacific, in the Pacific direction, but to the Atlantic direction. How Potosi how Potosi could forge, could construct projects to the Portuguese monarchy or to the Spanish monarchy during the Iberian Union, to settlers to go in the hinterland, to find this continuity between Peru and Brazil, the lands of Brazil. Then in my research, I found that the Portuguese was trying to put Pacific very far from Portuguese projects, exactly to turn from the Pacific to the Atlantic routes, and put Brazil in the way of silver from Potosi or from other mines to Spanish.
Yeah, Andrea, I found that fascinating about your book, this attempt to make Potosi a part of an Atlantic geography rather than part of a Pacific geography, which of course, Potosi is really much more of a Pacific geography because that's the major flow of silver. I mean, some of it comes down the Rio de la Plata, but most of it is going to the Pacific, and it's supposed to go to Panama and across the Atlantic, but of course, so much of it crosses the Pacific to Manila. Katie, to answer your question, one of the things that motivated my book was, of course, once I learned about González de Mendoza, this got me into scholarship about the Manila Galleon. There's been so much interesting work done in the last 30 years by economic historians, by art historians, historians of material culture, but there hadn't been that much done by people in my field who looked at literary and cartographic representations of the South Sea. And so what occurred to me was that there was this enormous scholarship now, or this burgeoning scholarship on the early modern Pacific centered on the Manila Galleon trade, but I didn't see a lot of people talking, not when I started this work, there have been books that have come out since, there weren't a lot of people talking about how Pacific space was actually conceptualized by the people who were building and living and constructing and placing hopes in the possibilities of the Manila Galleon. And I think that's what my book is trying to do. It's trying to answer the question, well, all these people who were trying to set up the economy that eventually became that of the Manila Galleons, those who participated in it and everything that they implied, what did this space look like to them, or how did they conceptualize it? That's what I'm trying to get at. And I'm trying to get at an idea of the new world that has this openness towards Asia, this porosity towards the Pacific, this connectedness with Asia, and one where Potosi is very much this hinge phenomenon, because it's always a question of which way is the silver traveling and which way do different constituencies want it to travel.
Definitely. We are going to have to leave it there. I do remind you that Katharina's book is already out and Ricardo's is coming out with University of Chicago Press, which there is a 20% off. Well, yes, look, he has Katharina's book right there.
I don't have it's hard to find.
There is a 20% discount for it. Matthew Edney's showing his too, but his background's interfering. But there is, we really can't see it, Matthew, but it's cute. So there is a book discount available. Jordana has put the link to that and a few other documents in the chat. And now I'm going to finish this meeting so that I desperately hope you all run over to the concluding remarks. We beg your attention for 15 minutes more, and then we will close this entire conference. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our speakers. And please get all of their books and read them. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
No problem.